Good evening, everybody. It's your boy E Buck, and this is the Big Buck Sports Report for Friday, May 19th, 2023, a day that some of us will now remember as the day in which one of our great sports icons passed away. That, of course, would be the man himself, one Jim Brown. I could not allow for this to pass without me having some thoughts and words in regards to Mr. Brown, as he represented an important figure in my personal life, of which I will explain along the way. But I also feel it important for us to give homage to our heroes as they leave this life and move on to our ancestors, to basically give them some more of the flowers that they deserved when they were alive. So I feel Jim, unlike some of our athletes that leave us far too soon, did receive a lot of those flowers and blessings from those who really appreciated what he did for us in terms of being a role model and to a greater degree a icon of our people. Um, it hit me kind of hard today when I first saw the news a little bit after 2 p.m. today. Keep in mind, Jim Brown did live to be 86 years old, so it's hard to feel completely crushed knowing that he was able to live a full life in regards to what we consider full these days. The reports say that he basically died in his sleep, which I imagine, since we all know at some point in time we have to no longer be here, would be our preferred method to leave this place if we have to choose one, if we get to choose one. So there was that. But in terms of Jim Brown himself, I really felt it important that I basically educate some of my audience on who he was, what he represented, and of course give you my perspective of what he meant to me personally and to a person in my family as well. And just basically to give homage to a man that was very deserving of that honor in my eyes. So we will spend this particular episode of Big Buck Sports Report honoring the man known as the great Jim Brown. Now, of course, for many of you who are sports enthusiasts, which I imagine would be the greater part of the audience of this show, you best know Jim Brown as this man here, the man who played for the Cleveland Browns in the NFL for 9 seasons. Of course, before that, he was a student and an athlete at the University of Syracuse, one of the schools that was basically in my top 10 for where I would go, because, of course, Jim Brown went there, and also the fact that it was a big journalism, well, still is a big journalism school, and at the time, I wanted to be a journalist, and I also wanted to be an athlete. Keep in mind, never quite lived out that dream. For those of you who are from the neighborhood, you know me to have been a decent neighborhood athlete, but in terms of actual pro or high school or any of that, that dream was not lived out by me. Um, One of the people that I wanted to emulate in being such an athlete is one Jim Brown. Uh, Jim basically because he was one of the athletes that my father looked up to. And that's who first introduced me to Jim Brown as an athlete. I basically got to learn his story in reading, as I was an avid reader as a child. And I was so impressed with what I read in regards to him that I actually did one of my book reports on Jim Brown. Got an A on that report, by the way. Um, Understand, Jim Brown was not just your run of the mill athlete. He was basically one of the better athletes, perhaps of all time. When you think about the multi-sports athletes, such as, say, of course, the great Bo Jackson and people of that ilk, understand that Jim Brown was in that vein. Just at Syracuse alone, he was an athlete who played not only the sport of football, but also ran track and played for the basketball team. But understand, for the greatness that became Jim Brown on the football field, and he was actually a pretty good athlete in the other two sports I mentioned, they say to this day, for those who know of the story, that perhaps for what he was as a football player, he was perhaps even better at this particular sport here. That you see is a young Jim Brown in a lacrosse uniform. Yes, I said lacrosse. Understand, for those of you who know sports, you may know what lacrosse is, have some idea, may have seen a game or two. Or for those of you who don't know, that lacrosse is basically regarded as one of the sports of kings. Put it up there kind of like with polo and things of that nature. It was not typically a sport that you saw a lot of African Americans play and very little thrive in. That being said, one of the better sports coaches at the time was the coach of the University of Syracuse, and he basically said to his dying day, and many people backed him up on this, that Jim Brown, if he wanted to be, would probably be the best lacrosse player of all time, bar none, not even close. He felt that he was even better at lacrosse than he was at football. Now understand the magnitude of that statement when you consider how good a football player Jim Brown was. Remember, Jim Brown played just 9 seasons in the National Football League in the late 50s and early 60s. In those 9 seasons, he was a 3-time MVP. 3 times in 9 seasons, okay? That in of itself remarkable. Understand that Jim Brown is the only non-quarterback to have won 3 MVPs in the National Football League. Think about that stat for a minute. Also understand, in those 9 seasons, he ran for over 12,000 yards and scored over 130 touchdowns. These are records. I think even today, that 12,000 yards is still top 10 all time in NFL history. The 130, I believe, is top 5 in NFL history in regards to touchdowns. And we're talking a man who retired some 60 years ago, almost. So consider that. Understand that in those 9 seasons, the NFL, as we know it now, was very different back then. We're talking the NFL where they didn't have the type of equipment that they have now, where the rules are way different in terms of what you can and cannot do. It was a much more violent game, the NFL. That being said, Jim Brown at that time was considered to be the very best player in the National Football League. How ironic that this man, one of the things I learned today was that the team that drafted him, the Cleveland Browns, he was not their first, second, or even third pick going into that draft. That year that the Cleveland Browns had that particular pick in the draft, they wanted a quarterback, one of the quarterbacks that came out. And because all of the quality quarterbacks were taken, basically it was said that the general manager was like, well, I guess we're drafting Jim Brown. How crazy does that sound right now? Because in the end, that man not only won MVPs, but he brought the city of Cleveland its last football championship in the year 1965, or 64, I should say. He then went on 1965 to win the MVP. And in that last year in which he won the MVP, then went on to, at the age of 29, a mere 29 years of age, decide that he was done with the National Football League and retired during the offseason, doing a movie, no less. On the actual set of the movie, he decided he was going to retire because the team, for one, would not want him to finish the movie. They wanted him to come practice. They also were in contract negotiations. I mean, at that time, Jim Brown, quite frankly, felt like he should be the highest paid player in the NFL. Hard not to argue that when you're a 3-time MVP. And they basically did not agree. So at that point, seeing a different future for himself, he decided to leave the game of football. Understand that in those 9 years, it was rough on Jim Brown. He took all types of abuse and punishment, both on and off the field. Remember, we're talking about the volatile 50s and 60s, where our nation, well, I can't say much like now. I mean, though we are still segregated as a country, let's be honest, was going through a lot of turmoil in terms of black and white. He still was dealing with certain places that did not want him there, certain places where he was not allowed to enter and whatnot, even though he was indeed the great Jim Brown. All that being said, he went with his convictions and retired an MVP, retired as the greatest football player there has been at that point. It's not hard to argue that he is probably one of the top 3 or 5 football players of all time when you basically think about, okay, you got Tom Brady, you got Jerry Rice, you got Lawrence Taylor. He's somewhere on that list after one of those 3. In my personal opinion, also understand the greatest running back I have ever seen. I'm not talking about Jim Brown. Of course, I mentioned the great Barry Sanders, being a Detroiter all my life and a football fan for a good most of that. To my recollection, to what I've personally seen, Barry Sanders is the greatest running back who ever lived. That being said, even the great Barry Sanders himself has said in his mind he is not the greatest, Jim Brown is. And many of the reasons why he felt that way is because his father often would tell him, yes, Barry, you are a good running back, but the best running back of all time is Jim Brown. It would always be Jim Brown. That's the type of respect that his father had for that man. That's the type of respect that Barry Sanders eventually had for that man. Uh, you'll see many iconic photos, I'm sure, in the next 48 to 72 hours of Jim Brown. One of them, I'm sure you will see quite a bit, is the one with him, Emmitt Smith, and Barry Sanders together. Basically, it's 3 of the greatest running backs ever in one photo. I can only imagine what that conversation was like that day. But understand, when we talk about the great Jim Brown, him being a football player and a future Hall of Famer is only part of what made him great. There was more to the Jim Brown story after his retirement. And we will get into that after we take this short break here on the Big Buck Sports Report. Tonight, we are honoring the great Jim Brown. There will be more after these words from the Nighthawk Network.
Hello, hello, hello. It's another glorious day, my T-Sippers, and you know what time it is. I hope you have all the...
Oh, sorry about that, guys. Hold on one moment, please. Hey, this is Eric Buckner here in the Nighthawk Network studios. And for those of you that have pet care, grooming, and vet needs, we want you to contact here in the Detroit area, Meet You There Pet Care. That's Meet You There Pet Care, LLC. The phone number is 313-471-4970. So for those of you that have pet care needs here in the Detroit area, please contact Meet You There Pet Care. They will get you situated with all your home pet care, grooming, and vet tech services. And do know that we want to promote all small and minority businesses here in the Nighthawk Network. Make sure you contact me on the Nighthawk Network Detroit page or on Eric Buckner Messenger or Eric Hawk 45 Instagram to get your thing promoted here on the network. Thank you. Have a good one. Hello, my friends. We are here on this rainy Friday here in Detroit, remembering, of course, the great Jim Brown, who died. Actually, they say he died late last night, but it was announced today that he died at the age of 86. A remarkable man who had a remarkable life. Football just being part of that life. Want to get into more of his actual story now. Basically, once he retired from football, he then went on, for starters, to go into acting. Of his acting credits, he played in over 30 films over the course of the next 25 to 30 years, some of which you remember, Dirty Dozen and things of that nature. There are also some minor films he played. He played in a couple blaxploitation movies, a couple of movies even in the late 80s and 90s. But I think what he is most remembered for at that point, oftentimes being seen in that particular image there, is for who he was outside of football as a civil rights activist. Understand that Jim Brown was very thoughtful and outspoken in regards to things that involved the African American community. Once he retired, he was often seen with some of our civil rights leaders, such as the Malcolm X's and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world, supporting their platforms and programs. Also, of course, he is probably best remembered for the summit that he created once it was learned that Muhammad Ali had chosen not to go to the draft in the Vietnam War and thusly was stripped of his boxing credentials. If those of you remember this iconic picture here, there you see, of course, the great Jim Brown, who was said to be very instrumental in having that meeting of the minds with many of the black leaders of our time at that point. You see some of the great athletes that we know who were also civil activists. Of course, right there to the left of him, you see, of course, the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is still amongst us. Of course, the late Muhammad Ali there, and of course, someone who we recently lost as well, the great Bill Russell, among others, who basically came to the defense of Muhammad Ali and stood for him and stood with him. And also, he is also remembered for his stance against gang violence throughout the country. He oftentimes met with many gang leaders throughout the nation to try to get them to come to peace and put the guns down and stop the violence in our neighborhoods. Basically, any major metropolitan area that had a large black population and several that didn't. Know Jim Brown to have come there to help in their causes. You know, there's those certain people that we remember in the African American community that come out when things go awry, so to speak. Jim Brown was one of them. Of course, we talk about people such as Jesse Jackson and, of course, Al Sharpton, people of that nature. Understand there are fewer of them nowadays, unfortunately. We don't have a lot of quality black leaders that we can stand on and say that that's that. We got Pride Hunter checking in the store. I played lacrosse at Cranbrook, and it is a very challenging and demanding sport. I have played lacrosse before myself. Trust and believe, it is not easy. Understand that it's a combination, a little bit of hockey without skates, soccer, and some great hand and eye coordination to go along with it. It is a very physically demanding sport. So for you to be truly good at it, good to the point where there are actually to this day certain rules in regards to lacrosse where you cannot make certain motions, you can't hold the ball towards your chest or whatnot, and basically bully your way to the goal. Those rules were put into place because of Jim Brown. He is the reason why you have some of those rules in lacrosse today, based because he literally changed how they played the game. That's just how good an athlete he was at lacrosse, and just how good an athlete he was in general. But like I said, he was also a good leader for our people. Now, understand why I sit here touting the many great things that Jim Brown did. There were also controversial things in his life. Some people had an issue with the fact that Jim Brown, very pro-black in certain aspects, but was very not so much when it came to the dating world. He was have known to be dating people that were outside the race, and some people had issue with that. Also, he is known to have been arrested on several occasions for possible acts of domestic violence, allegedly. Whether those happen or not, I cannot say. I was not present or live for such reports and whatnot, but I know they exist, and you know that is part of his legacy. Unfortunately, remember some of our great athletes that we have lost. I mean, such as Kobe Bryant, they also have a couple negative strikes against them, unfortunately. But in terms of what he did as an overall life, there was a lot more good than bad, fortunately. Now, like I said, he was one of my father's favorite athletes growing up. And what I learned because of my dad loving Jim Brown and basically making me be curious about his life was just how tough an individual the great Jim Brown was. When you look at, hold on, I never understood his stance on the cap situation, but still love and respect him, which is another thing that we can talk to in terms of some of the good and bad that is Jim Brown. Understand that he basically did not agree with Cap in regards to his stance with the NFL. He was very outspoken against that. He also gained criticism from me for his stance with the president, as in the previous president. He was a backer of the former president, which of course y'all know how I feel about that. A man whose name irritates me to the point where I don't even like to say it publicly. But yeah, I mean, even though he did support Obama, he supported that president as well. So those are things that people kind of had issue with. I know I did. I'm still hurt to hear this news, says Hugh. Yeah, me as well, my brother. Me as well. That's why I had to come and speak on it and pay a little homage to the man himself. Um, Understand that as we've seen an older Jim Brown over the years, you gain a real understanding of how tough the game of football truly was. Remember, this man retired at the age of 29, at that time seemingly in full health. As we saw Jim Brown in later years, he was very decrepit body wise. Basically, he oftentimes walked on a walker, sometimes was not able to walk and actually used a wheelchair at times. His body basically broken and sore for those years and years of pounding he took as a football player. Um, as much as I wanted to play football as a child, I'm very thankful that that was not what became of me. I mean, even to this day, from just a little bit that I did play, I feel there's a couple small nagging injuries that I have, particularly on days like this when it rains and I can hear my knee crackle, basically from years of playing sports and standing on my feet working. That affects me. So I can only imagine what that feels like to play many years in the NFL, particularly at the running back position, taking the type of pounding that Jim Brown took, how his body must have felt in these later years. You know, a lot of us say that, yeah, I want to live to be as old as I possibly can, but we also have to remember as we get older, our body does as well. And I imagine we all kind of have that point where it's like, okay, Lord, I don't know how much more of this I can contend with. And you can only wonder if that's what some of the thoughts in recent days that went through the mind of one Jim Brown as he reached this point today where he is no longer among us. Jim Brown and Barry Sanders walked away from the game. They both could have easily held the rushing record. I mean, understand, Jim Brown did hold the rushing record for many years, despite the fact he only played 9 seasons. Until, of course, we know the late, great Walter Payton broke that record. And we all know that Barry Sanders, by rights, should to this day be the all-time leading rusher, but he chose to lead the game. And I think part of why he chose to lead the game when he did was because of what Jim Brown did and wanted to lead the game on top. Like I said, there's no doubt in my mind that I'm not trying to hear nothing about Emmitt Smith or Eric Dickerson or anybody like that. Barry Sanders was the best running back of all time. That being said, it's hard not to argue his point. Because Barry Sanders will tell you that Jim Brown is the greatest running back of all time. Because imagine if he played 6 more years, he probably would have set a record that no other running back would ever break. Especially in this day and age of running back seen as secondary player. I begin to wonder if we ever gonna see in the next 5 years more 10,000-yard running backs after whatever we have right now. You know, Frank Gore aside, I think the shelf life for running back may be 9, 10 years from this point forward. Much like in the days and ages of the starter that goes the complete distance in baseball. I think it's just certain positions that are changed forever based on this day and time. I wish Barry Sanders had that O line Emmitt Smith had in Dallas. Absolutely. We can only imagine. Hell, for all intents and purposes, I wish Jim Brown had that line that Emmitt Smith had in Dallas. Who knows how many more yards he may have gained. Because if you see a lot of those old highlights of Jim Brown, a lot of those yards Jim Brown got on his own, much like Barry Sanders. Barry created a lot of that on his own. When you look at those, and like I said, for those people who over the years got compared to Jim Brown, people like, of course, the infamous O.J. Simpson, people like the great Earl Campbell, people like Ricky Williams, people like Eric Dickerson. because they had that power running style. The great Bo Jackson. But when you look at those people, they didn't have the longevity. They didn't have the overall success. They were not the iconic running back that Jim Brown was. Like I said, many of us who are here commemorating were either not alive or very, very young when Jim Brown was a running back in the NFL. Keeping in mind that they just had the 100-year anniversary of the league, he still made that team years later, over 50 years after he retired. That's just how good Jim Brown is. We are not just talking about an iconic athlete that was one of the best in his sport. We talk about perhaps one of the best athletes who ever lived. I will say it again. One of the best athletes who ever lived. Understand that there's been well over 20 billion people who have walked the face of the earth. When I put you in that category, that's a very, very small. That being said, I look at some of today's athletes. Unfortunately, let's take the unfortunate example that is John Morant right now. I can only imagine what Jim Brown's thoughts were in regards to that young man and what he's doing with his platform, as opposed to what Jim Brown and others of his ilk did with theirs. Like I said, Jim Brown was far from perfect. There were issues. I'm sure those will come up because, oftentimes when we remember our people as they pass, we remember it all, the good, bad, and the ugly. I'm pretty sure that they will consider doing a movie about Jim Brown. Some of those things will come out at that point. I think he is worthy of that, a biopic in his honor. Who would I have play Jim Brown? Dan. Well, the best person is a person that's kind of been in trouble himself, I think. Mr. Majors, Jonathan Majors to be exact. I think he would be a good person to play Jim Brown if they do the movie, but considering some of the troubles he's having lately, who knows? But nonetheless, I had to use my platform to have this discussion with you because it's important that we remember our people as they pass through this life. It's important that we educate our people, particularly people that look like us, about some of our greater African American people that have come along in this life, especially now where it seems like our educational system is failing us in regards to teaching history, the full story of our American history. People like Jim Brown will fall under the wayside when we start to have discussions about history and whatnot. I mean, when you look at a subject I'm going to talk about next week, this whole AI thing, when we have those type of things at our usage, you begin to wonder how important will it be for us to even learn history in the future. In the end, basically, if you learn your numbers and letters and how to type, that might be all you need to know this point forward. The rest of the education may not matter. He was saying people were trying to say Chris Kaman had a lot of guns and nobody criticized him, but he was never out in public or on Instagram live flashing his guns. And the guns that Chris Kaman I might had were legal guns, and many of them were hunting guns. And Chris Kaman was known as being an avid hunter. And I'm sure there are several other athletes that are hunters as well. It is definitely a different thing. They always try to make the black-white race issue a bigger black-white race issue with some folks because I feel as African Americans, some people just hate when we are criticized, whether we are right or not. I mean, I've said it publicly, I'll say it again. OJ did it, allegedly. But we know, okay? And some people to this day, they're like, no, they're praying and whatnot. I don't feel that way. Bottom line, John Morant, he did it. He did it. And he was wrong for doing it. And I still say whatever circumstances and consequences come to that young man, he is very deserving thereof. Just like there were circumstances and consequences for some of the actions of Jim Brown in regards to some of the things he did. Like I said, he was not a perfect man, but he was a good man. He was a man that many people looked up to and admired. not only for his convictions, but for his character, for his actual strength, both mentally and physically. I mean, it was said among some of the Jim Brown stories you'll hear that yeah, there were times when Jim Brown was hurt, but he never would let anybody on the team see him get any type of treatment for anything. We talk about a time where they had spikes and no gloves, flimsy helmets, flimsy pads, where basically they would punch you, kick you, stick you in the eye in the scrums that were the piles and whatnot. All those things happened to Jim Brown and probably 4 and 5 fold. But basically said that he would come in very, very early in the morning, get his treatment so that nobody on the team ever saw him get hurt. So that when all was said and done, he'd be like, well, yeah, Jim, blah, blah, blah. Nope, Jim's fine. No problem. Let's play ball. He was that type of leader of men in that regard. And even though, like I said, in his later years, you could tell he was a crippled version of himself, he still was very outspoken and outgoing to many of the rallies and cries and whatnot of our day and the days previous. So I definitely wanted to give him his flowers for that as well. But all that being said, I'm about to call it an evening. I hope that you guys will check this out. I do believe we will be able to get this on Instagram as well. I think I have finally figured out that Rubik's Cube puzzle of a way to do that for us. And if so, please like and subscribe and give your comments on this particular episode when you see it. And the future episodes of the Big Buck Sports Report that you should be able to find on Instagram, assuming it all works correctly. He was saying Jim Brown gets my utmost respect. Back in his day, football was way more physical, absolutely, and way more violent, I might add. And like I said, I will never fault him for leaving his prime. To this day, some people felt, okay, why did he leave in his prime? What was the real reasons and motivations thereof? In an ideal world, I don't fault any. I mean, tomorrow, if one of the greats in the NBA or NFL decide to call it quits early, like say, take a Mike Trout for instance, hell, he done made his money. He has played at a Hall of Fame level. He is what, about 30, 31? If he decide to hang up tomorrow, I'm not mad at him. He owes us nothing. Jim Brown owed them nothing. He did more than enough for that team in that city. Remember, there's one football championship in 1965. There's not been another since in the city of Cleveland. He was the MVP of that team. He was the MVP of that league when he retired. He had nothing to prove to nobody. He made it to the NFL Hall of Fame in 1971. Quite frankly, I think for athletes like him who choose to call it early, I can argue that they are worthy of being in the Hall of Fame that next day. To this day, I feel like Tom Brady could be in the Hall of Fame right now. Why have to wait for 5 years? Just basically because everybody else did. I mean, there were exceptions to that rule. I mean, I definitely have to point out the great Roberto Clemente, who was put in the Hall of Fame soon after his death because he was more than worthy. But yeah, in the end, let us honor Jim Brown. Let us honor the memory of Jim Brown. Let us go against those who basically will point out all the wrong things that he did in his life as opposed to the great things that he did instead. Let us make sure that we teach our young people what he meant to us as a community and as a person and not let that lesson be lost. I am a big fan, of course, of education, and I really feel like we as a people need to do more of our educating of our young people at home, especially since they are choosing not to teach them certain things that I feel we need to know as a people. Totally agree, says Facebook user. Thank you for the thumbs up. So yes, this is going to be the end here of the Big Buck Sports Report. Until the next time we join you here on the O, we got Joe Mosley checking in. What up, Big Joe? What's happening? Thank you for supporting. As always, we appreciate you, sir. I'm sure Jim Brown was a hero of yours as well. Um, yeah, again, the unfortunate passing of Jim Brown is what we came to celebrate. And remember, in life, as opposed to always commiserating and feeling sorry for who is lost, let us also remember to celebrate their life as well. So hopefully there will be those things as well. And if there's not a statue of Jim Brown somewhere in Cleveland near that stadium, it very well should be. That is all I have for you. Tune in later on this evening for our guy, Big Meech and Dish and T. Not sure what they're talking tonight, but I will be tuning in. Until next time, y'all, be safe, be blessed, don't stress. And God bless you, Jim Brown, wherever your soul may be this evening. This has been a remembrance of Jim Brown here on the Big Buck Sports Report. Good night, y'all.
The following broadcast is a Nighthawk Network